Welcome to another of my true crime tales. For this video, we're going to travel 160 miles northeast from London to pay a visit to the city of Norwich, where in June 1851 a gruesome and mysterious murder occurred. Despite a thorough and extensive investigation by the police, no clues were forthcoming, and thanks to an error on the part of several doctors and surgeons, it would be 18 years before the perpetrator of the dreadful deed finally faced justice and was hanged for his crime. So let's venture back in time to uncover the horrific story of the brutal death of Martha Sheward, whose husband William very nearly got away with murder. On the morning of Saturday the 21st of June 1851, 34-year-old Charles Johnson, the son of a Methodist preacher, was walking his dog along Miss Martineau's Lane around 1.5 miles from the centre of Norwich when the animal sprang over a hedge into a plantation and returned with what appeared to be a piece of carrion clenched firmly between its jaws. Johnson and a passer-by called to the dog to drop it, but the animal ignored them and ran off. On arriving home, Johnson found his dog waiting for him, and taking a closer look at the item it had carried from the plantation, he saw to his horror that it was in fact a severed human hand. He took the gruesome find to the police, who were then based here at Norwich Guildhall, and Superintendent P.M. Yarrington promptly dispatched several officers to search the locality where the dog had found the hand. A constable was also sent to fetch local medic Dr. Peter Nichols, who, on being shown the hand, gave it as his opinion that it was that of a woman, but since there wasn't a great deal more he could do, he ordered that it be placed in a bucket of spirits to preserve it. The next morning, a human foot was unearthed in another plantation 200 or so yards further along the lane from where the hand had been found, and a further search resulted in the discovery of 2 portions of vertebrae and a pelvis. Searchers also found a black-striped waistcoat and a quantity of waste cotton, such as a mechanic would use, concealed in a hedge close to where the initial discovery had been made. These were taken to the Guildhall, where Inspector Peck, the officer who had direct charge of the case, placed them in the bucket alongside the hand. Later that day, Dr. Nichols and 2 other medical men, Mr. Norgate and Mr. Donald Dalrymple, arrived at the Guildhall and carried out a full examination of the remains thus far brought in, all 3 concurring that they were the bones and other parts of an adult female. Although the searchers spent the rest of Sunday and all day Monday combing through and turning over every heap of manure or rubbish likely to conceal any further body parts, nothing more came to light. But then, on Tuesday, more gruesome discoveries were made. A fibula was found at the lime kiln on the Helleston Road, some 2 miles from where the hand had been found. A police constable found a humerus near the garden of a Mr. Manning at Lakenham, a neighbourhood located in the southwest district of Norwich. Various pieces of flesh were found at other locations, and a second fibula was discovered on Helleston Road, a little further along from where the first one had been found. Other pieces of flesh that had evidently been cut from the surface of the body came to light on Wednesday, a portion of the patella being attached to one and the sciatic nerve to another. Notwithstanding that they had been found at so many different places, the Norwich Mercury reported, and in spots a considerable distance apart, they were found to join when tried, thus proving that they all belonged to one body. From this, the paper continued, it would seem that the body has been cut into pieces some time after death, and that the author of this atrocity has endeavoured to get rid of it by depositing small portions in different localities at different periods. At 11 o'clock on Thursday the 26th of June, the Mayor of Norwich, Mr. Henry Woodcock, along with magistrates Mr. P. Money, A. Trowler and J. Betts, together with local coroner Mr. Wild, assembled at the Guildhall to hear evidence from the surgeons Mr. Nichols, Mr. Norgate and Mr. Dalrymple. Mr. Nichols informed them that he and his fellow medics were in agreement that the remains were those of a young adult female. From the general appearance of the flesh, he continued, it is my opinion that there is evidence of youth and health at the time of death. Some portion of the remains appear to have been immersed in some fluid. This appears to have been the case with the foot, the hand, and the part of the pelvis and spine. The portions found in the different localities indubitably belong to the same person. I consider the individual, of whose remains these are a part, may have been dead a fortnight or perhaps longer. Asked by the coroner how old the victim was, Mr. Nichols replied that he and his medical friends believed that she was between 16 and 26 years old. Mr. Wilde stated that at the present time he did not think the matter was in a fit state for him to open an inquest, and his fellow members on the panel shared that view. Several people with missing relatives, Superintendent Yarrington informed the sitting, had called at the station house in states of great alarm to ascertain if they could identify any of the parts. Charles Wellings of Wellington Street, St Giles, was concerned for his 17-year-old daughter, who, accompanied by her brother, had left home 7 or 8 weeks previous to go to Bradford in Yorkshire. The siblings had separated at Sleaford in Lincolnshire, and her family had not heard anything from her since. James Norman, weaver of Wellington Lane, reported that his daughter, Louisa, aged 20, had been absent from home for the last 5 or 6 weeks, and he had heard nothing from her. A girl named Seals, who was 16, had been missing for some time, and her father, a greengrocer's assistant, was most concerned for her well-being. However, since the victim's head had not been found, a positive identification was nigh on impossible, and so the court was adjourned, pending further police inquiries. The panel reassembled on Friday the 27th of June, and it was agreed that a jar and a quantity of spirit should be provided for Mr. Nichols to preserve the body parts in. The panel also authorised the release of a placard, which read, "City of Norwich, supposed murder." Several parts of a human body belonging to a person supposed to have been recently murdered, and to be that of a young female between the ages of 16 and 26 years, having been within the last 4 days found in the environs of the city of Norwich, information is requested to be given to the Chief Constable at the Police Office, Guildhall, Norwich, of all females who may have been recently missed, together with any particulars which may lead to the detection of the person or persons who committed such supposed murder. The portions of the body already found comprised the right hand and foot and several bones, with numerous pieces of skin and flesh. Further search is making for the head and remaining parts of the body. Signed, H. Woodcock, Mayor. Over the next few weeks, remains continue to come to light at various locations around the city and its outskirts. On Saturday the 28th of June, the police found a piece of skin and a segment of muscle in a field alongside Hangman's Lane, now part of Higham Street. That same day, a portion of shin bone that had been found on the Hellerston Road on the previous Friday was delivered to the police office. It had, so the Norwich Mercury reported, been given to a dog. There was a large piece of flesh, which, together with part of the bone, the dog consumed, the paper concluded. A portion of thigh bone, which bore evidence of also having been gnawed by a dog, had been found by some men who were cutting grass in a field alongside the Hellerston Road. Mr. Scales, a scavenger, and his son John had been cleaning out a drain, or cocky as drains were known locally, in Bishopsgate, when they noticed some blood around it. Having taken what they had removed to a public receptacle for refuse located on Bull Lane, they returned to examine it the next morning, bringing a policeman with them. On sifting through the detritus, they found a portion of breast and some entrails, which the officer then took to the Guildhall. More and more pieces of the victim continued to turn up over the first 3 weeks in July. On the afternoon of Saturday the 12th of July, Henry Leighton was mowing the grass in the churchyard of St. Peter's Southgate when he uncovered a human foot that had evidently lain there for some time. It had been cut off at the ankle joint, and the toes were contracted in a manner identical to those on the foot that had been found previously. It too was taken to the Guildhall, where it was found to match the other foot found previously in both size and appearance. A week later, a youth named Field, whilst walking in the garden of his employer, Mr. Merry, the coal merchant, noticed a piece of flesh lying in the grass. He summoned a workmate, and together they turned it over, finding that it was a human hand, which was slightly decomposed on the inside. They immediately took it to the police office, where the surgeons examined it and were certain it was the victim's missing left hand, from which the third or ring finger had been cut off, evidently, the doctors opined, to prevent it being known whether the victim was married or unmarried. Later that day, a Mr. John Wright, who lived opposite the Dolphin Inn, Upper Higham, arrived at the police office to report that at about 11:30 on the night of the 2nd of June, he remembered having heard a female scream loudly 5 or 6 times. The screams, he told the police, appeared to be those of a person in great agony or danger, and to come in a direction from Higham Causeway. It was a promising lead which the police followed up, but to no avail. Their inquiries, it was apparent, were getting nowhere, and they were no nearer to catching the murderer or identifying the victim than they had been a few weeks earlier when the first remains had been discovered. Some people, though, were beginning to doubt that it was in fact a case of murder. The Norwich Mercury pointed out that the unsatisfactory result, which has hitherto attended the exertions of the police to obtain a clue which would throw any light upon this affair, combined with the facts that all the reports they have investigated have been foundationless and that no female is missing from the city unaccounted for, has led many persons to inquire, has a murder after all been committed? We stated last week that a report prevailed that the remains which had been discovered had evidently been deposited by some young surgeons who, having obtained a body for dissection and not knowing what to do with it, had disposed of it in this bungling manner. Be this as it may, the opinion is gaining ground. Superintendent Yarrington, however, was emphatic that a brutal murder had occurred, albeit he was of the opinion that it hadn't actually been committed in Norwich. Mr. Yarrington expressed his conviction that the murder was not committed in Norwich, the Mercury reported, having ascertained from a careful search of the parochial registers that no person answering the description of the murdered woman is missing, but he believes that the various portions of the mutilated body have been brought from a distance and scattered about the suburbs of the city. However, despite the lack of progress, the decision was taken to bury the remains in a sealed container in a vault beneath the Guildhall, in order that they could be located and exhumed should there be any future breakthroughs. This was duly done, and over the next few weeks, press interest in the case waned, and the people of Norwich had soon put the horror of this gruesome episode behind them. Whoever had carried out the crime had, so it seemed, got away with murder. But unbeknownst to the authorities, they had inadvertently aided the perpetrator to evade justice by publicising the surgeon's belief that the remains were those of a woman aged between 16 and 26 years old. In Tabernacle Street, a thoroughfare that ran off Bishopsgate and which was located about 300 yards from the drain in which Mr. Scales and his son John had found the portions of intestines and the breast, William Sheward, the occupier of number 7, must have breathed a huge sigh of relief. William, who would later be described by those who knew him as a quiet and inoffensive man, had been born in Walworth, Surrey, in November 1812. In adult life he had become a tailor and was living and working in Greenwich when in the early 1830s he met a woman by the name of Martha Francis in Richmond Street, Walworth, whom he persuaded to move in with him as his housekeeper. Martha came from the town of Wymondham in Norfolk, where she and her twin sister Mary had been born on the 29th of March, 1797. At some stage in her early adult life, Martha had left Norfolk for London, where she found work as a servant and housekeeper. As far as her family in Wymondham were concerned, Martha was doing well for herself, and they considered her to be living the high life. Indeed, her sister Mary would often be the grateful recipient of her siblings' cast-off clothing and shoes, which fitted her perfectly, both women being of the same small stature. Despite the fact that Martha was 15 years older than William, romance blossomed between them, and on the 28th of October, 1836, they were married in St. Alfred's Church in Greenwich. The bride was 39, the bridegroom 24. In 1838, the couple left London and moved to Norwich, where they lodged for several months with Martha's sister Mary and her husband, William Nunn. Some newspaper accounts gave his name as William Bunn, in St. James Street. Sheward worked for a local tailor, and by 1840 the couple were renting rooms in Bear Street, after which they moved to White Lion Street, where William set up in business on his own. Trade, however, was slack, and in 1849 he went bankrupt and was forced to close his shop. He found employment with pawnbroker and moneylender Mr. Christie, with whom he deposited a cash box containing the substantial sum of £400, probably to keep it out of the hands of his creditors, although where the money actually came from was never explained. It may have been Martha's money. In early 1851, the couple moved again, taking the tenancy of No. 7 Tabernacle Street, a now vanished terrace of houses located on Bishopsgate, close to Norwich's oldest pub, the Adam and Eve. William had been drawing on the money lodged with Mr. Christie, and by the time the couple arrived at 7 Tabernacle Street, he had withdrawn £150. Martha, though, it seems, was unhappy with the arrangement, and she began demanding that her husband bring the box home. It is interesting to note that William appears to have been somewhat self-conscious about the age difference, as is evidenced by the fact that in the 1841 census he gave his age as 30 and Martha's as 35, and in the 1851 census his age is listed as 40 and hers as 45. Sarah Batson, who lived next door to the couple in Tabernacle Street, would later describe William as a gim little fellow, explaining that she meant he was an active, brisk-walking man. Martha, she said, was a middle-sized woman who dressed neatly and was very ladylike. She was light-complexioned, with almost golden-coloured hair, which she wore in curls or ringlets. Asked how old she thought Martha was, she stated that she looked to be in her late 50s. Significantly, Sarah said that she never heard any arguments emanate from behind the walls of 7 Tabernacle Street. All the neighbours who were later traced remembered the Shewards as a not particularly noteworthy couple. Martha was pleasant and sociable, whereas William very much liked to keep himself to himself and rarely spoke to them. In fact, so unobtrusive were the Shewards that none of the neighbours could actually remember exactly when Martha had disappeared, nor for that matter when William had moved out of the house in Tabernacle Street. As to what happened to Martha, we have to rely on William's confession, which he made many years later as he languished in Norwich jail, awaiting his execution. His chillingly matter-of-fact account of the long-ago events was given before the prison's governor, John Howarth, the chaplain, Robert Wade, and visiting justice, J. Goodwin Johnson. Recalling the events of June 1851, Sheward stated that, "Christie asked me if he might make use of the money. My wife seemed determined to fetch the box herself. I knew he could not give it to me." On the 14th of June, 1851, Mr. Christie asked me to go to Yarmouth to pay £1,000 to the captain of a vessel laden with salt to enable him to unload on the Monday morning. On Sunday morning, the 15th, I was going to Yarmouth for the above errand. She, my wife, said, "You shall not. I shall go to Mr. Christie and get the box of money myself and bring it home." With that, a slight altercation occurred. Then I ran the razor into her throat. She never spoke after. I then covered an apron over her head and went to Yarmouth. I came home at night and slept on the sofa downstairs. Sheward then proceeded to reveal what he did with the body and its parts over the next week. On the Monday, I went to work. I left off at 4 p.m. and went home. The house began to smell very faint. With that I made a fire in the bedroom and commenced to mutilate the body. Kept on until 9:30 p.m. I then took some portions of the body and threw it away, arriving home at 10:30. That night I slept on the sofa, went to work again the next day, went home in the afternoon about 4 o'clock, did the same night again. On Wednesday went to work as usual, left off early and went home. Carried some more portions in a trail basket to another part of the city. Thursday worked the same and returned early. The head had previously been put in a saucepan and put on the fire to keep the stench away. I then broke it up and distributed it about Thorpe. Came home and emptied the pail in the cocky in Bishopsgate Street with the entrails in. I then put the hands and feet into the same saucepan in hopes they might boil to pieces. On Friday I went to work and went home early and disposed of all the remains of the body, hands and feet included, that night, because I knew I should not be able to be home on Saturday until late. On Sunday morning I burnt all the sheets, nightgown, pillowcases and bed-tick, and all that had any blood about them. The blankets where there were any blood I cut in small pieces and distributed them about the city and made off with any that had any appearance of blood about them. The long hair on my return to Thorpe I cut with a pair of scissors into small pieces, and they blew away as I walked along. Thus ended William's confession. It was around the time he said he had done all this that the body parts started turning up around Norwich, so William must have been on tenterhooks, thinking that the police would be knocking on his door at any moment. One wonders how he reacted when those he worked with in the pawnbroker's shop, or the customers, discussed the mysterious murder and pondered the identity of the victim, little realising that the perpetrator of the crime was standing right there with them. The next problem that Sheward faced was explaining Martha's disappearance to her family and friends. Fortunately for him, the family still resided in Wyndham, and it would be some time before they began to wonder why they hadn't heard from Martha for a while. This gave Sheward the opportunity to concoct his story, and when they began asking questions, his answer was ready and well rehearsed. She had, he told them, left him and gone to New Zealand to be with a man whom she had known before she became his housekeeper in Greenwich. He even claimed that he had walked her to the railway station, where he had watched her board the train for London. Martha's sister Mary, however, wasn't convinced, and she went to see Sheward. Her niece Elizabeth went with her, and she would later recount the conversation between her aunt and Sheward. My Aunt Nun said, "Mr. Sheward, I have come to ask you about my sister. What have you done with her?" He replied, "I don't know. I have done nothing with her. She left me quite penniless. She cared nothing about me." Mary was having none of it, and scolded, "Sheward, you are a false man. My sister never left this country." However, no one amongst Martha's family, friends or neighbours appears to have connected her disappearance with the human remains that had been found across Norwich, and if any of them suspected that she had been the victim of foul play, they certainly didn't make their suspicions known to the police. William actually left 7 Tabernacle Street in September 1851 and rented 3 unfurnished rooms from Mr. John Bird at St. George's Middle Street, bringing his own furniture from Tabernacle Street with him. According to Mr. Bird's later recollection, Sheward lived alone, but after about 6 months, a female began visiting him. "One evening, I and my wife returned home rather unexpectedly," Mr. Bird would testify at Sheward's trial. "It was in the summer of 1852. The female was in the house then, and from what I saw, I gave Sheward notice to quit. The first female who visited him in St. George's was not the same woman." Sheward apologised if he had given offence, but said that in consequence of what Mr. Bird had said, he should leave. Sheward next moved to 103 King Street, and whilst living there began a relationship with Charlotte Mary Buck, who may have been the woman that Mr. and Mrs. Bird caught him with when they arrived home unexpectedly. In March 1853, Martha's Aunt Fisher died and left money to Martha and her siblings. Martha's younger sister Dorothy went to see Sheward and asked him, "Will you be kind enough to tell me where my sister is? I should like to know where she is. I wish to know particularly." Sheward's gruff reply was, "Your sister can write to you if she pleases. She knows where you are." Mary Nunn wrote to Sheward regarding the aunt's death and received the following reply. Norwich, 24th of March, 1853. "Mrs. Bunn, I am sorry to hear that Mrs. Fisher is dead, but your sister not being in Norwich this present, I shall not take any part in arranging of affairs. Therefore you need not expect me, nor send me any more about it. Signed, William Sheward." Unperturbed, Mary and William went to King Street and told Sheward that they had come to know what had become of his wife. "Will you be so kind as to tell me the last words she said to you?" William probed. Sheward said that he had walked with her to the railway train, and as she was boarding, he had implored her, "If you won't write to me, you'll write to some of your sisters." Martha's response had been, "No, never." Sheward invited the couple to stay for dinner, and they noticed that his hand trembled a great deal as he attempted to cut the meat. Indeed, so noticeable was the tremor that William Nunn remembered commenting to his wife, "Dear me, what's the matter with Mr. Sheward? He can't cut a piece of meat, his hands shake so." Sheward, he recalled, made no comment. William Nunn pressed Sheward about his separation from Martha, and later recalled that it seemed to put him out of spirits. He left off talking about her and appeared to be disposed to talk about anything else but her, he later recalled. By the mid-1850s, William had set up in business of his own accord as a pawnbroker, and he and Charlotte were living as husband and wife in King Street. In 1856, their first child was born, a daughter who they named Charlotte. Their second child, Naomi, was born in late 1860. Charlotte was nursed through both pregnancies by Mary Lee, who would go on to care for her through several more. Mary later recalled that, during Charlotte's confinement with Naomi, she had learned that the couple weren't actually married. This had troubled her somewhat, and she had, she said, chided William Sheward in decidedly biblical terms. I found that they were not married, and I asked why they lived in whoredom, as the first Mrs. Sheward had been dead a long time. He replied, she might have been married before if she liked. It may have been this conversation that prompted the couple to commit, and they were married at Norwich Registry Office on the 13th of February 1862. Over the next 6 years the couple had 3 more children: Arthur, born in 1863, Sarah, born in 1864, and Clement, born in 1867. However, all was not well in the Sheward household. William had started drinking heavily, and there were frequent arguments between the couple. In 1868, Sheward found himself once more in financial difficulties, and he was forced to sell his pawnbroker stock. The family moved to Oak Street to take the lease of the Key and Castle Tavern, at which hostelry they all lived on the premises. William, though, was rapidly spiralling out of control. His drinking increased over the next few months, and by Christmas 1868 he had become somewhat depressed in spirits, and he told Charlotte that he would be leaving for London to visit his sister on the Monday after Christmas. However, on the day in question, he didn't feel well, and so he delayed his trip until the next day, Tuesday the 29th of December, when, having spent a very restless night, he kissed Charlotte and the children goodbye and headed for the station to take the train to London. On the night of Friday the 1st of January 1869, Inspector Davis of the Metropolitan Police's P Division was on duty at Carter Street Police Station, Walworth Road, when an elderly gentleman who was in a state of great agitation came in and said, "I have a charge to make against myself for wilfully murdering my first wife Martha at Norwich. I have kept the secret for years, but I can keep it no longer. I left home on the 29th of December with the intention of destroying myself. I intended to cut my throat with the razor I have in my pocket." Davis asked him for the razor, and the man at once took it from his pocket and handed it over. The man then continued, "I have been to Chelsea today and yesterday by steamboat, intending to destroy myself, but the Almighty would not let me do it. I wish I could have done it." The man then dictated his confession. "I, William Sheward of Norwich, charge myself with the wilful murder of Martha Sheward, my first wife." He then signed the statement. He appeared perfectly sober and natural in his ways, Davis later recalled. "I then put him into a cell, and he moaned very much during the night and seemed in great distress of mind." The next morning, Davis asked Sheward if he remembered what he had said to him the previous night. "Yes, perfectly well," was the prisoner's response. A few hours later, Sheward appeared before the magistrate, Mr. Woolrich, at Lambeth Police Court, charged on his own confession with the wilful murder of his wife Martha. The prisoner, a gentlemanly-looking man, was so weak and feeble that he had to be seated during the hearing of the case, and wept bitterly and appeared to feel his position deeply, the Express reported in that evening's edition. Davis recounted how, in answer to his question about how he had committed the murder, Sheward had replied, "It was on the 15th of June, 1851. I cut her throat with a razor." "How did you dispose of the body, or how was it that it was not discovered?" Davis asked him. Sheward replied, "The body was cut up, and I believe a portion was kept in spirits of wine at the Guildhall at Norwich by order of the Magistrates." Davis had then asked how it was that he now came and confessed. "I went last night to a house in Richmond Street, Walworth, where I first saw my first wife, and that brought it so to my mind that I was obliged to come and give myself up," was Sheward's reply, adding, "You'll find it's quite true, and they will know all about it at Norwich." At the conclusion of Davis's evidence, the magistrate asked Sheward if he had anything to say or any questions to ask the inspector. "No, your worship," replied the prisoner. "Is the statement made by the inspector correct?" the magistrate asked. "Yes, your worship," came the reply. "I shall remand you for further inquiry," Mr. Woolrich said. "Very well, your worship," responded Sheward. And with that he was removed from the court and was conveyed by cab to Horsemonger Lane Gaol. Back at the Kean Castle in Norwich, Charlotte and the children remained blissfully unaware of the drama that was unfolding in London. But on the morning of Sunday the 3rd of January, Charlotte was alarmed to receive a letter from her husband stating that he was in trouble and telling her that she would soon learn the nature of it. That day she must have been at her wits' end, not knowing what had happened to or with her husband, nor for that matter what the trouble was he was actually in. In London, Inspector Davis was unsure about the case. True, Sheward had confessed to a murder, but how did he know that he wasn't delusional? Furthermore, how did he know that there had actually been a murder? He therefore sent a telegram to Mr. Hitchin, the chief constable at Norwich, and later that day he received the reply that human remains had indeed been found around Norwich at the time that Sheward said he had murdered his first wife. Davis was now certain he was dealing with a terrible murder, and the police in Norwich began combing through the records of the mysterious case from all those years ago. That evening, a constable was sent to the Kean Castle to break the grim news to Charlotte of exactly what the trouble was her husband was in. By the time of Sheward's next court appearance on the afternoon of Thursday the 7th of January, it was more than evident that everything Sheward had told Davis corresponded with the known facts of June and July 1851 in Norwich. Entering the court, Sheward took his seat in the dock. The prisoner appeared to be more cool than on the last occasion, the Newcastle Chronicle reported, and exhibited not the slightest emotion during the proceedings. Inspector Davis testified that having communicated with the authorities at Norwich, he had very strong grounds for believing that material evidence in support of the charge would be forthcoming. The magistrate then turned to Sheward and asked if he wished to question the inspector. Sheward said that he took exception to the inspector's claim that he had used the word wilful when he confessed to the murder, and wanted to know if Davis was certain that he had used that word. "Are you sure that the prisoner made use of the word wilful?" the magistrate quizzed the inspector. "I will swear the word wilful was used," Inspector Davis replied. "That is all I have to ask," replied Sheward. "The rest is perfectly correct." It was decided that the case should be transferred to the city in which the murder had occurred, and to that end Inspector Davis was tasked with taking Sheward by train to Norwich later that day. Since an angry crowd was expected to gather at Norwich's Thorpe railway station, the police played it safe and took him off the train at the previous stop, Trouse. He was then conveyed by van to Norwich police station. The next day, Friday the 8th of January, he appeared before the mayor, Mr. E.K. Harvey, and the magistrates at Norwich Guildhall, the very building under which the remains of the woman he was supposed to have murdered lay buried. Mr. Mendham, town clerk for Norwich, appeared for the prosecution, and Mr. Stanley, solicitor, appeared for the accused, who, the papers reported, was so frail that he had to be provided with a chair and remained seated throughout the proceedings. Inspector Davis testified about Sheward's confession on the night of the 1st of January, adding that no inducement had been made to the prisoner to lead him to make the confession. On asking him further questions as to how or where the body parts had been found, Davis stated that Sheward had replied, "Oh, don't say any more, it is too horrible to talk about." Sheward, he said, had told him that he had had no food for 2 days and that he could not eat. Davis had offered him some food, but he still said he was unable to eat. He did, however, drink a cup of coffee. Having heard from several other witnesses, including Mr. and Mrs. Batson, Sheward's neighbours in Tabernacle Street, and Inspector Peck, Mr. Mendham asked for a remand, to which the magistrates readily agreed. The prisoner, who wore an air of hopeless although subdued depression, was then removed, the Morning Herald reported. The case seemed cut and dried. After all, Sheward had confessed to the murder, and the facts certainly bore out what he had said had happened. But then on the following Monday, the newspapers began reporting that Sheward intended to retract his confession, and that he and his friends would, so the Manchester Courier reported, endeavour to show that when he made his statement, he was labouring under a kind of monomania. At his subsequent court hearings, Sheward pleaded not guilty to the crime. Over the next 2 weeks, witness after witness arrived at the Guildhall to give evidence. Those who had found the body parts, or at least all those who were still alive, testified as to where, when and how they had made the gruesome discoveries. By the time of Sheward's next court appearance, the remains had been exhumed from beneath the Guildhall, although it was reported that they now consisted of only bone, as the flesh had not withstood the ravages of time, in spite of the attempt made to preserve it. Inspector Peck, Mr. Nichols and Dr. Donald Dalrymple, who was now the Member of Parliament for Bath, recounted the measures taken to identify and preserve the remains. The 2 doctors reiterated that they believed them to be the remains of an adult woman, but both men denied having stated that her age was between 16 and 26. Neighbours gave evidence about the couple who had lived at 7 Tabernacle Street, although none of them was 100% certain as to when Martha had actually gone missing or William had moved out. The police, it transpired, had gone round and taken up the floorboards of the house, but nothing had been found, and they had had to pay compensation to the current owners of the property for the damage done. Various members of Martha's family testified as to what they had observed of Sheward and his behaviour in the years after Martha's disappearance. Martha's twin sister Mary had died 2 years before, so it was her husband William and various relatives who spoke of her exchanges with Sheward. Sheward's final appearance at the Guildhall was on Monday the 1st of February, when the mayor committed him to take his trial at the next assizes on a charge of wilful murder. The prisoner, who trembled slightly, the Echo reported, was then removed. Sheward's trial began on Monday, March the 29th, 1869, and lasted 2 days, with Judge Mr. Baron Piggott presiding. The prisoner had to be assisted into the dock by 2 officials, the Illustrated Police News reported. He was very pale, but pleaded not guilty with tolerable firmness. He is understood to be suffering severely from rheumatism. Since the body of the victim had not been officially identified as that of Martha, Mr. O'Malley QC for the prosecution based his case largely on Sheward's confession. He suggested that William's relationship with Charlotte Buck had begun whilst he was still married to his first wife, which might, he thought, suggest a motive for the crime. Many of the witnesses who had already testified at the Guildhall repeated their evidence in an effort to show that what Sheward had stated in his confession could be verified by what was known about the grisly finds of 1851. A seemingly important fact emerged during the trial. Several family members were asked about a carpenter named Worseltine, with whom Martha was supposed to have lived in Chancery Lane in London prior to her marrying William Sheward. There was a suggestion that this was the man whom Martha had left William for in 1851. Mr. Metcalfe for the defence called no witnesses, but argued that the prosecution had not proved its case beyond reasonable doubt, as there was no actual proof that Martha Sheward was dead, let alone that she had been murdered by her husband William. He pointed out that the doctors who had examined the remains at the time were of the opinion that they were those of a much younger woman than Martha. Finally, he stressed that, although the police had carried out a thorough search of the house at 7 Tabernacle Street, not even a vague trace of blood, or anything else for that matter, had been found. In his summing up, the judge told the jury that the question they must determine was whether the accused murdered his wife, Martha Sheward. There was, he said, direct evidence of the prisoner having implicated himself on the 1st of January 1869, but the jury must decide whether that confession was true. He also mentioned the discrepancy between the doctor's belief that the victim was a young woman and Martha's actual age. There could, he said, be little doubt that Martha Sheward had disappeared in June 1851, but it was for the jury to decide whether she had disappeared dead or alive. And with that, the members of the jury retired to consider their verdict. They were out for just over an hour, and on their return, they found Sheward guilty. Baron Piggott then donned the black cap and passed the death sentence. Sheward was taken back to the city jail, where because of his feeble health, he was lodged in the infirmary to see out his final days. His friends and family prepared a petition to the Home Secretary and the Attorney General, hoping to persuade them to commute the death sentence to one of life imprisonment. Round about the 19th of April, word leaked out that Sheward had made a full confession, and although the contents of the confession were being kept secret until after his execution, excerpts began appearing in the newspapers which made it clear that he had murdered Martha. On Monday the 19th of April, Sheward learned that his petition for a reprieve had been unsuccessful and that he was to be executed the following morning. A few hours later he had a farewell interview with his second wife Charlotte, which according to the newspapers was of course a very painful one and appeared to have been unexpected by the convict. Sheward had, it transpired, already composed a farewell letter to Charlotte, and this was published in the newspapers following his execution. It was a self-righteous, self-pitying epistle which began, "My dear wife, I write to you under the impression that this is the last I ever shall write, and I sincerely beg of you in the name of God to be resigned to your fate, for it is God's providence that has brought on this change, and who knows but it may be for the best." Having urged her to forget him, he wrote that he was very sorry and heartily grieved that I should have been the instrument of drawing you into all this trouble and affliction, and I sincerely thank you from the bottom of my heart that you have been able to forgive me, so that now I shall be able to rest at peace with God and man. Now it is my painful duty to say goodbye, and that forever, for I must turn my mind to higher things, which will give you great consolation to know that by making all reparation in my power to God, I feel that I can die happy in the full assurance of a blessed Redeemer interceding for me at the throne of grace, and that I shall be forgiven. May the Lord's blessings ever attend you, and may you and the children ever be happy, is my utmost wish. Now, by God's will, I must bow my head in peace and say goodbye. Goodbye from your unfortunate husband, William Sheward. On Tuesday morning, having slept reasonably well, Sheward got up at 5:30, dressed himself, and spent his last few hours praying with the prison chaplain, the Reverend R. Wade. A little before 8 o'clock he attempted to walk to the scaffold, but being unable to stand due to his severe rheumatism, he was carried there by 2 warders. The doomed man had shown a considerable amount of nerve and composure thus far, the Illustrated Police News reported, but after he was pinioned, a tremor set in, which continued until his life had passed away. Once on the scaffold, Sheward shook hands with those present, including the executioner, William Calcraft. The noose was then placed around his neck, the bolt was pulled, and, according to the Morning Herald, the convict was committed to his fate. His struggles were slight and brief, and his lifeless body soon dangled in the light April wind. And thus the curtain came down on a mysterious and, at times, bizarre case. Sheward was buried beneath the city jail, the site of which is now occupied by Norwich's Roman Catholic Cathedral. In June that year, Madame Tussauds were advertising that they had added his portrait to their infamous Chamber of Horrors in London. The remains of Martha Sheward had by then been reinterred in the vault beneath the Guildhall, where they remain to this day. In 2019, the Reverend Fiona Horworth was joined in the Guildhall's undercroft by Martha's great-great-niece, Sandra Francis, and a blessing was carried out over Martha's final resting place, thus giving a closure of sorts to the woman whose brutal death went unnoticed by the majority of those who knew her. The case certainly leaves us with several unanswered, not to say baffling, questions. What led Sheward to carry out the terrible crime? Why, having got away with the murder for so many years, did he suddenly feel compelled to confess, thus blighting the lives of his then wife Charlotte and their children, and of course ending his own life? Why, having confessed, did he then retract his confession? Of course, all these questions are now impossible to answer. Perhaps you have an opinion. If so, let me know in the comments section below. I hope that you have found this true crime tale interesting. If you have, please give it a like and be sure to subscribe to my channel. And until we meet again in the dark and mysterious labyrinth of England's true crime underworld, stay safe.